or when it comes to it, but it's just to make you aware that this meeting is being recorded. And also, if you need captions, they are available to you. So if you just look at the bottom of your screen there, you should be able to get the closed captions if that's something that you need. So let's make a start. So this is basics and boundaries of online safety. So it's going to be talking through what we know about online safety and its risks to women working in journalism and media particularly. We're going to take a look at some harms categories. So when I refer to online harms, it's quite a kind of umbrella term that is used often in academia and often by people who are working in online spaces. And essentially the word harms covers a multitude of different issues, and we'll take a look at some of the key issues that I know affect women working in journalism and media today. We'll also then have the opportunity to share experiences, so that if you've got questions or points to raise around specific things, you can do. We'll then take a look at some top tips, so the things that you can do to protect yourselves, a look at how to set boundaries and how that can be helpful, and also some of the things that you probably shouldn't do if online harms do happen to you. And then finally, we do have some resources and tools before we look forward to what's going to be coming up in the online harms series, which is being run by myself and Women in Journalism. So let's go straight in and look at specifically the research around women working in journalism and online harm. So many of you may be aware of research that I conducted with Women in Journalism and Reach earlier this year, and we released the findings of that on International Women's Day. So that was March the 8th. The research had 403 women participants working in media and journalism in the UK. So that was quite a decent number of people took part. And what was really interesting to see was that the findings actually really reflected findings that have been done from that came from international studies conducted by UNESCO, for example, which also found that 75% of participants taking part in their research had experienced some kind of online harm in the course of their work. So you can see that out of the people that took part in this research, 20% were freelancers and 80% were in full-time employment. And that's important because you can see in a moment, we'll take a look at the impact of online harm on freelance particularly. Many were in, almost 3/4 were in roles that had a public-facing element to it. And there was a good spread of different experiences that actually took part. So some of those women had worked in journalism for more than 21 years, and some had been in industry for less than 5 years. So there really was a decent breakdown in terms of the experience that women had in journalism that took part in this. And out of the participants, you can see that 75% of participants said that they'd experienced some kind of threat to their safety during the course of their work. And Janelle has kindly put the link to this full research in the chat as well, if you do need to see that. There was also a quarter that had experienced some kind of sexual harassment or sexual violence in connection to their work as well. Almost 50% said that they were reducing their visibility online, and that was obviously impacting their opportunities, because we work in online spaces as part of being in journalism. Quite often our presence online and our visibility is a huge calling card. It's part of our CV, often, you know, is what people use to actually promote their own work online. And obviously, if that's having that kind of impact, it really is having a chilling effect on the visibility and opportunities of women working in journalism. And almost a fifth said that they'd considered leaving industry entirely because of this. So on the back of this research, we did want to put together this series, which actually takes a look at some of the key issues raised by the research, and hopefully offers some solutions as well, because obviously we know what the problem is. You're here today because of the problem. Let's see what some of the solutions are that we can identify and that we can personally control. I mentioned freelance, and that's obviously important. Some of you today may be working in freelance positions or maybe considering freelance roles. And obviously, if you are working as freelance, you may have less of a support network around you on a regular basis than those that are actually working in full-time employment and have an employer that might be looking at these kinds of issues as part of the offering that they have. So it's really important that we offer tips that actually can be applied by individuals working independently, as well as those that might be working in a more organisational environment. Some of the categories that had been faced by the women that took part in the research, you can see here. So a fifth of participants said that they'd actually experienced some kind of long-term harassment or sustained harassment from an individual or set of individuals as part of their work. This is a significant concern and is something that I'm looking at more deeply as part of my role at WiJ as well. There was also significant different harm categories that came up again and again. So we'll take a look at these in more detail in a moment, but those were, for example, hate speech, so racism, gendered slurs, gendered hate, and backlash as well was quite significant. Personal comments is something that I see being reported on a regular basis within the role that I do, and obviously that came out quite clearly from the research that I conducted as well. And we know that actually quite often online harm is intersectional, so we'll see backlash that involves hate speech, that involves personal comments and other things as well. There was also more than a third reported being intimidated face-to-face at some point. So that's something that the series that we're going to be running from Women in Journalism is going to be addressing later this year. And almost half of respondents said that they'd experienced some kind of misogyny or harm connected to their gender in connection to the work that they were doing. So that takes us through some of the research findings, which have obviously fed into the workshop that we're doing today. So I wanted to kind of break down some of the categories of online harm and take a look specifically at some of the key things that come up within the role that I do on a regular basis, and that I know are also affecting women working outside of WiJ, you know, working in other parts of industry, broadcast, print and social and other areas as well. So obviously they are intersectional, as I mentioned, and you may recognise some of these from the course of your work that you do. It'd be really interesting in a moment to maybe hear some of your experiences. So obviously, if we start off with very serious situation, we do sometimes see specific threats being made. So specific threats to either kill or cause harm are threats that essentially involve very detailed facts and very detailed kind of points to actually take notice of. So it might be that the person making those threats identifies a specific address, identifies how it is that they're planning on causing that harm, and also they might identify a date and a time. And so that is what we would refer to as a specific threat. And obviously in that situation, I'd recommend reporting that to the police immediately, because it has the hallmarks of something that's obviously been thought about and planned, and we need to make sure that the response is as serious as the threat itself. We also do see, unfortunately, and this is much more common than those specific threats, indirect threats being made. And so they are, I would say, the threats that we see coming through that might be less specific in terms of when, where, how, but can be equally as alarming for the person on the receiving end. So it might be the kind of thing where somebody says something like, I know where you work and you better watch your back because I'll be there next time you are. Obviously, they don't specify where that person works, so we don't know whether they really know that or not, but it can still have that same absolute chilling effect, and we should still take those kinds of threats as seriously as those that are made very specifically. So again, if a threat like that does come in any way, please do report it to the police. Please do tell somebody about it as well, not just police, so that you're getting the support that you need. And we'll take a look in a moment at some of the things that can be done to actually respond to these kinds of online harms. Very commonly, unfortunately, we do see journalists being faced by online backlash or pile-on or dog whistling. Quite often this is related to something that they might have broadcast or published or had a hand in working on, and usually it'll be a subject that either is divisive or that people will have a strong opinion about. And so we do see, unfortunately, journalists being on the receiving end for being the messenger rather than actually being the people who are causing the issue that they might be reporting on. But if you're reporting as a journalist or covering as a journalist something that people don't want to hear about, so it might be, an example would be health stories, where you might be covering a new vaccination for COVID-19. We know that that can prompt a certain section of our society to instigate a backlash, to deny that COVID-19 exists, to deny that the vaccinations work, to deny the science and the expertise around that, and also quite often on the back of that to spread misinformation and conspiracy. And unfortunately, the journalists can often find themselves in the centre of that storm simply for reporting the facts around that particular issue. Harassment and targeted abuse over time, stalking, smear campaigns are, I would say, one of the most challenging things to manage, quite often because they fly below the level of community standards set by social media organisations, and quite often because they take place over a number of different platforms and a number of different ways of actually making that contact with the journalist. And we do know that social media platforms, so Meta and Twitter, for example, do not connect with each other particularly around this kind of thing. It usually has to come from a police investigation or a criminal investigation that those social media companies will actually feed into that and actually start kind of joining the dots between the different platforms. So for me, in the role that I do, it's one of the most challenging areas to actually tackle. And there are definitely some tips around how to manage that kind of situation, how to regain some control, and the things that we can do to then build and document evidence to actually then make a criminal report. So we've also got, as I've mentioned previously, hate speech and hate crime. Unfortunately, we do see journalists facing this quite often targeted at them personally. So it might be to do with an ethnicity or religion or gender. And it might also be targeting the sources of those people that are being covered within stories as well. And obviously, again, this is a criminal offence and we should treat it as such. Physical instances connected to online production, online work. Unfortunately, we do see this taking place. And if you work in broadcast, you've probably, been aware of stories where somebody might have been approached in the street, while they're conducting the broadcast by somebody who wants to be abusive or harmful towards them. This is something that, again, we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail later in this on harm series. So there'll be some kind of broad brushstroke top tips today, but a lot of it we'll be looking at in more detail later on. Doxing. So if you're not aware of what that is, that's where your personal information might be taken and then used for malicious purposes. So it might be that somebody's drawn that personal information from personal social media accounts, for example, or LinkedIn, and they might actually be then using it to either impersonate you or to spread malicious lies about you, or to actually conduct some kind of malicious activity connected to you. We can protect against that quite significantly using multi-factor authentication, which is something I'll look at in more detail in a moment, but it's worth me connecting that directly to doxing now, because doxing can be one of the most distressing things to happen. It obviously makes you feel violated, it can make you feel exposed, it can make you feel embarrassed or ashamed. None of those feelings we should be feeling, as if somebody's gone into our accounts and used that information against us. It's obviously we are the victims in that situation. It can cause all of those feelings and feeling of regret for not actually putting your protections higher in the first instance. So do use multi-factor authentication, because it can be one of the biggest barriers against those people who are wanting to dox, and we'll take a look at it in a moment. Hacking, so obviously somebody hacking into your accounts, again, something that we can protect against using multi-factor authentication. Impersonation is an issue that we unfortunately see on the rise in journalism. So people might take a photograph and then pretend to be a specific journalist or working for a specific brand, and then might use that that profile to actually either spread misinformation, or we do see, unfortunately, quite often journalists being hacked into having their accounts hacked and then impersonated so that they can actually do that for financial benefit as well. Because obviously as journalists, we quite often have a significant number of followers on our accounts. And we also have the gravitas of being journalists and being in that qualified position. And so it makes our accounts very attractive online for people to hack and then impersonate us for financial gain. Personal comments is unfortunately one of the most common things, and possibly if you're going to ever experience online harm, it might well be personal comments that you do experience, and they can be obviously very upsetting and something that, you know, really is completely unnecessary, but people feel they can be very personal about other people online, maybe in the same way that we see road rage taking place. And often it's connected to ability, journalistic ability, education, experience, the way people look, the way people sound. And unfortunately, we do see those specific kinds of personal comments directed at women more than we do so at men. And then finally, I did want to include on here other types of harm might include suicidal communications and communications connected to self-harm. And that is unfortunately something that we do see as journalists, because people will see us in a position of power potentially. Maybe we can do something to help them if they're in a very desperate and difficult situation. And there is some really good guidance from the Samaritans, which I'll share with you at the end, about how to manage that, because obviously you might have the responsibility of that weighing on you as a journalist. There's good ways that we can signpost, and there's a really good piece of advice from the Samaritans which actually gives you a template response as well, which can really help manage those very difficult situations. And then obviously, as I've mentioned, sometimes we see threats and harm against our story subjects as well. And then finally, threats to share intimate images without consent. And there is a significant amount of support that we can see online from that. And actually, Meta takes that very seriously. And there are ways of reporting that in a supported way that hopefully will get a reasonably quick response from Meta if that kind of threat is made on their platforms. I've put a question at the bottom, and it's a question because I'd be really interested to see your thoughts. Please do put them in the Q&A box, you know, if you've got thoughts around this. But does regular and persistent criticism count as abuse? Now, clearly, we are in a society where we need to be able to levy criticism so long as it's justified. And the advice that I tend to give to people when this question arises is, if the criticism is fair, and then that person is directed about how to make a formal complaint if they need to, and they don't take that direction up and instead continue to criticize vocally and publicly online or in online spaces, I would say that starts to become abusive and harassing, because they've not followed the protocols that you've offered them about how to make a complaint properly, and therefore they are essentially making threats and not necessarily following them through. Usually there will be some kind of formal complaints procedure available for us to direct people to, whether that's Impress or IPSO, whether it's your own internal organisation's complaints procedure, etc. And so obviously directing people to that can sometimes feel a bit frightening if you're worried that they're going to make a complaint and that it's going to damage you, but actually directing them to that can be the best thing to do, because it means that you have that support from the organisation and you have that rigorous attention that's given to it by a third party. And it does mean that you can then justifiably block somebody if they continue to complain about you online, and you can pointedly make the point that you have given them the details of what they need to do to resolve the situation. So if they then continue to complain in that space, it means that you really are justified in blocking them and muting them and removing them from your situation. So I don't know if anybody in the group does have any experiences that they'd like to share. But if you do have any, I will obviously not name names, and I won't talk about any situations that would identify any specific people. If you do have something that you'd like to share, I will just give you a moment to actually put that into the Q&A box, and then we can take a look at that as a group. I'll just have a sip of water while I see if anybody does put anything in there. Please do be aware that this obviously is being recorded, so any examples that are given, while I will do my best to make sure that they stay anonymous, obviously this is being recorded and may be used as a resource by people down the line as well. So, you know, do bear that in mind if you do share something in the Q&A box. Okay. I can't see anything coming in straight away. So what we'll do is I will continue to move through the training. If anything does come in, we can then take a look at that as the session progresses. So obviously we've looked specifically at some of the key problems, but so far I haven't necessarily given you a huge number of tips about how to manage these situations. So that's what we're going to be moving on to now. So first of all, we're going to be looking at how to create boundaries. And this session, I did particularly want to look at boundaries online because obviously in the world that we live in, we do quite often find ourselves having a social life online that then sometimes blurs with our professional life online. And it's good to be able to set those boundaries. And to set boundaries, you need to actually consciously think about what your boundaries are, what your limitations are, what it is that you're willing to give away and what it is that you don't want to give away. And I do think that that's an important process to actually consciously go through, to actually be able to identify what it is that you're happy for any person online to see about you, what it is that you would really prefer only those that your close family and friends would know about you. So these top tips here hopefully will help with you setting those boundaries. And actually, I'm going to come to this one first, which is make a list of the things that you'd like to keep private. So that might be family, it might be where you live and regular places that you visit. It might be other things about you that you just don't want absolutely anybody to know about you. And I think it's really useful to actually make that list of things you just don't want people to know. Because when we are in the spur of the moment, when we are working at a fast pace, when we're promoting stuff online or engaging our audience online, it can sometimes be easy to accidentally step outside those boundaries because we know that there will be something that maybe creates engagement with an audience member. We can sometimes step too far outside of that box. And so it's really, really worth having that list. And I'm not suggesting that every time you post, you then refer back to that written list. But what it does do is by writing that list, it then creates a mental checkpoint. So you can actually stop and think. And it's always worth, you know, in the same way that you stop to check the spelling, you stop to check the accuracy, you stop to check before you press send on any social post. Also stop to check, is my boundary, are my boundaries in place with this particular post? So obviously, we never want to give away exactly where we live. We don't want to give away what our back garden or front garden looks like, what our front door looks like, the road that we live on, etc., etc. So it's always worth thinking about, am I giving away too much when I put this post in? Think about your private accounts as well. So obviously it's really important that we if we do have accounts online that we use for personal use rather than professional use, that we create good protections on those so that those boundaries aren't overstepped by people who are going to try and find out information about us. So many journalists choose to use an alternative name on their private social accounts, for example. And while there might be some people who think, well, why should I have to do that? The sad fact is that it is useful to do that because we shouldn't have to do it, but it's a way of us taking responsibility and protecting ourselves in that situation, because people might try and find out more about us, and it's more difficult to do that if our names are different on our social private accounts. So it's worth doing that. It's also worth using different avatars to actually help separate out those accounts as well. That means obviously that if somebody is looking for your personal accounts online, it's more difficult to necessarily know that it's definitely you because your avatar is different. It also means that if you're using you're using the same devices to actually use two different accounts, that you don't accidentally post personal information on your professional account and vice versa. So it just means that you're helping to keep those boundaries, and that visual cue can be quite useful for many of us. So do use separate accounts for personal use and for professional use wherever possible. I know that's not always that easy, and it might be that you're down the road where you've actually kind of got the you've got an account that you use for both. But I would really, really recommend taking some time to actually keep that for professional use and to then set up a new one for personal use. And that's just because it just stops us from blurring those boundaries. It means that you can use your social accounts for leisure time without work encroaching into that leisure time. And it also just means that you're not necessarily going to have that mistake where you publish something that's too personal for public consumption. And if you have the privilege of having a second phone, I would definitely use that for those specific professional and personal accounts. So if you have a phone that you use for work, put your professional accounts on that phone. And that also has the benefit of actually then being able to switch that phone off and put it down, and then being able to use your other phone for your personal leisure time and actually be able to enjoy that without work again encroaching. So that helps you create those boundaries within your own work-life balance. So also here we have some more tips around creating boundaries. So in the same way that I've just advised that you have a list of things that you're willing to share in that public space, do think to yourself, does that list actually, does my history tick the boxes in that list as well? And do spend a bit of time, shouldn't take too long, actually just going back through your accounts and checking that things that are in the public domain, you're still happy for them to be in the public domain. So I did this not all that long ago with Twitter, and there are ways of searching through your back catalogue of Twitter using the search functions and advanced search functions to actually search your specific tweets and your replies year by year, and that helps make it a little bit easier on Twitter, for example. And I found a couple of tweets that named my daughter. I didn't want my daughter to be named on Twitter, so I deleted those tweets. And so it is worth doing that, just so that you actually, again, make sure that your back history is fitting within those boundaries that you've identified as helping you manage that work-life balance, helping you manage your online persona, and then your private life as well. Don't be afraid to block people and remove problem people from your professional pages. Now, obviously, we know, as we've seen earlier, that people who are abusing or being harmful towards you in your professional work can have a significant chilling effect on the things that you share online. So actually, by removing those people from that sphere, it means that it gives you a little bit more confidence that you can actually operate in those spaces without them coming to abuse you again. We're not public property. Just because we operate in online spaces does not mean that we should then accept anything that comes to us in those online spaces. So in the same way that if we worked in a public space such as a department store, if somebody came up to us and was abusive in that situation, they would be removed. We should do the same in our online spaces as well. As I've mentioned already, multi-factor authentication is one of the most important tools that you can use to actually protect yourself online. So it does put a huge barrier for those people who are wanting to dox. It puts a huge barrier in for people who are wanting to take your information or impersonate you. And it just means that it's more difficult for people to get into your accounts and then use that information that's actually personal to you against you in any kind of other online situation. We are culturally, obviously quite often sharing information about ourselves in real time as well. And obviously, again, that gives away our locations. It can give away where we are. It can give away our movements. It can let people know that we're not actually in our homes as well, so it makes our property vulnerable sometimes. don't feel the need to share in real time. I know sometimes that might be more difficult. It might be more difficult if you're doing a live, for example. It's quite clear that you're on location in that live situation, but there'll be multiple times that actually we could take a photograph of something and then put it on our accounts later and share it later. The other thing just to mention that actually isn't on that top tip, which should be, is turn location tracking off. So location tracking is something that geotags you, and it operates across multiple social accounts, so on Twitter and on Meta products as well, and I'm sure on others too. And it just tells people where the photograph was taken and the time and the place, and we don't need people to know that about us and about our locations, about our movements. So do switch those things off. You can do it via the settings on those social accounts. And finally, do make sure that you're making time for yourself. So like I said before, if you can have a second device so you can switch your work account off, then that's great. It just gives you some breathing space from your professional accounts. And do try to create that space for yourself. Now, I know a lot of people will talk about the benefits of going out into the fresh air and actually digital detox. Sometimes though, we want to use digital tools for our own personal time. And if we want to sit double screening in front of the Kardashians whilst, you know, scrolling our own personal social media, that is something that we should be able to do, but we should be able to do it without work coming into that play, without people being able to abuse us and harm us in that situation. So I'm going to move on to some of the other things that we can do around protecting ourselves. So protection is absolutely your best defense. When we look at online spaces, one of the key issues when we are actually affected by online harm is that we lose a sense of control. So that loss of control, because there's people in online spaces who are doing things and saying things and behaving in ways that we just have very little control over. It can be quite frightening, it can be exposing, it can make you feel vulnerable. Sometimes, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount that we're going to be able to do about those people creating that situation. But what we can do is we can look to see where we do have control. And so much of our control comes from protection. So, for example, with your social settings, particularly on your accounts that are personal, how high do you have your settings? You can dox yourself. So you can essentially try and find out as much information about yourself as possible. So if you put your, if you go into an account, if you go into a search engine and put it into private mode or detective mode, you can actually look to see what information is available about you. You can look on, for example, Instagram and Facebook, what it looks like from the public perception. So you can click view as and then public, and it will allow you to see what's available about you. And often where we fall down is either if we've signed in somewhere, or if we've been tagged by somebody else, either in a photograph or in a location. So it might be that if you go to a festival on the Isle of Wight, your friend might have tagged you in a photograph that then means that becomes public because their settings are different to yours. So I think being aware of that and being aware of other people tagging you and making it clear what your boundaries and limitations are with those people, so that you can say, can you actually untag me from that, or can you change your settings so that it's more private? But also just being aware when you check in somewhere for a nice meal, actually that might then mean that that's more public than you'd intended it to be. Photographs can also be quite public, because if you look at Facebook specifically, there are ways you actually have to go in and make each set of photographs private. So it's just worth being aware of these things, and worth checking your privacy settings with the different social platforms that you use on a reasonably regular basis. So I would say check it now, check that you're happy with it, and then put a reminder in your calendar to go and check it again in 6 months' time, because we know that social media companies change their rules and regulations, and that can then alter the visibility that you have in those online spaces. If you are working in a particularly vulnerable area, so if you're covering crime, health, politics, if you know that you're likely to be subjected to online harm in some way or another, showbiz, lifestyle, unfortunately, often come into those categories as well, put it in so that you check it once a month. Because most of the time you check, you don't have to make any changes. It takes you 2 minutes and then you're protected for the rest of that month, hopefully. And if you do identify any problem areas, it hopefully means you can just adjust those quite quickly and it just protects you. So it is a little bit of work to start off with, but then actually keeping it up to date is really quite easy, and it is definitely worth it. Because what I do know from the role that I do is that quite often, if somebody faces some kind of online harm, they are really regretful that they didn't take those steps beforehand. And it's a little bit like you wouldn't leave your front keys in the front door, hopefully not intentionally anyway. So it's the same way, just make it more difficult for people to get at you, make it more difficult for them to attack you. So do separate out your professional and your personal use of online spaces wherever possible. And it is just worth me reminding everyone that no online space is absolutely 100% watertight. If we put something in writing, there is always that risk on email, on social, on text message, whatever, that somehow it will stop being private and will become public. So it's worth just bearing that in mind whenever you share anything online, that, you know, it's worth thinking, am I okay with this? Is this actually what I want to be sharing? Is this something that if it actually came out later on would damage me badly? And it's just worth putting those thought processes in place and making sure that you're using online spaces as safely as possible. Quite honestly, a lot of these tips that I'm talking through today are good advice for anybody, not just journalists, not just people working in media, because they're online safety and online literacy, essentially. So notification settings can be really, really helpful. So, for example, on Twitter, I have my notification settings quite high, so I don't let unverified accounts that don't have an avatar profile picture, accounts that have been set up recently, none of those I get notifications from. And that just means that people who set up accounts with a specific intention of being harmful find it more difficult for me to actually be aware of them in the first place. If I go away on holiday, I will quite often put my notification settings up to the highest level on Twitter, because what I don't want is to be on holiday and for Twitter to ping me and tell me that somebody's being harmful, or for me to come back from my holiday and feeling relaxed and chilled, hopefully, into a Twitter space that actually makes me feel less like that, because there's people who've been harmful and hateful during my time while I've been away. Nobody else will know what your notification settings are. So I use them and move them around all the time. It's very easy to do, just using the privacy settings on Twitter. I'm using Twitter as an example for that one, but obviously you can do it in other situations as well and on other platforms. So do use them, because if people are being harmful and hateful about us online, that's not a pleasant thought. But quite often we can't control that. What we can control is how exposed we are to that, and how exposed we want to be to those people who are essentially not bringing anything fruitful or positive or constructive to our lives. I've mentioned multi-factor authentication. I've also mentioned think about what you want total strangers to know about you. So that's the list, essentially. That's your boundaries list. What is it that you are happy with anybody knowing about you? Anything that doesn't fit into that category, make a note of it on your list. Check your past, as I've mentioned. So check the boundaries, it's within boundaries, but also that you're happy with everything that you've shared in the past and the opinions maybe that you've had in the past, etc., etc. Make sure that you are just happy with your social media footprint, your online footprint, and the way that you've behaved in the past, because obviously, again, we can see that sometimes coming back to bite us if we're not careful, and it is important that we are kind of being mindful in that way. And you'll see the last one is treat others as you would like to be treated. And I think that sometimes, I've seen people being critical of that piece of advice in the past, but actually I think it's a really good thing to just bear in mind. We conduct ourselves, hopefully, online in the way that we would like other people to conduct themselves towards us. If we behave badly online, it makes it much more difficult to hold the moral high ground and to actually, to kind of say, well, you're behaving badly and I'm going to report you. It makes it more difficult for us to reach out for help if we've behaved badly to start with, and we are the ones that have instigated, for example, a backlash inadvertently by having a Twitter spat online or something. So it is just worth thinking about how your online behaviours reflect on you and how you would like other people to treat you online, and to lead by that example. So all of these things we can put in place to protect ourselves, but unfortunately there will be times potentially when we might be exposed to some kind of online harm. So in that situation, obviously there are some things that I can advise. So number one, absolute top of the list, is seek support. So it might be that you're working as a freelance and you find yourself in the midst of a backlash. Don't suffer that alone. Make sure that you raise your hand, that you reach out to somebody that you trust. It might be a friend, it might be a family member, it might be a colleague, it might be somebody who's worked in journalism, it might be an organisation. But reach out and just ask for help and ask for support. Share what is happening to you. One of the key things that I find in the role that I do is that when people share their online experiences with each other, they'll find that there's a support network out there that they maybe hadn't realised existed, and that can be so important when it comes to not only in the midst of something happening, having that support, but also in the recovery process afterwards. Do use block and mute and report functions wherever possible. Some people sometimes say to me, I don't want to block them because they'll know that I've blocked them, they'll know that they've touched a nerve. And I often say, well, do you want them in your life? Do you want them to have access to you? By blocking, what we do is we cut off the oxygen of hate, essentially, because they know that they can no longer get to you. And the other thing is, if they do then try and get to you in a different way, that starts to become harassment, and we can start to treat it as such, which is actually a criminal offence. So do block people wherever possible. And Leona O'Neill, who is an academic who works at Ulster, she was and still is a journalist in Belfast as well. She tweeted this just at the weekend, and I just think it's absolutely sums up the way that I feel about blocking. People who complain, or people who go, oh, well, they blocked me, so they must, I must have touched a nerve. Is it something I said? Once they've said that, it makes them look foolish because it clearly shows that they care far more about it than the person that's blocked them. But B, once they've actually said that, if they say it again and again and again, it makes them incredibly dull. And actually it means that they lose followers because people actually don't really care. If you've been horrible online, somebody has rightfully blocked you, then actually who else really cares about that? So use block, do block people, do remove them from your sphere, let them know that they've been removed. That means that they can then no longer get to you the same way, and it does take some of the fun out of it for them. And there's a good example where we had a news title that was it's journalists, and the title itself was repeatedly being tagged in really quite unpleasant satirical content, which we couldn't get the platform to take a look at it because they said it was satire, they said it was clear impersonation, clear not impersonation, but clear kind of light-hearted banter, and it really wasn't. It was quite unpleasant for those people involved, so they just blocked this account that was making these comments, that was constantly tagging. Everybody blocked them, and at first the mentions went up, but obviously they weren't being notified of those because they were blocking them. But then also it did significantly decrease quite quickly, to the point where they stopped tagging them altogether and they've actually stopped posting. So it does have an impact, and sometimes it can take a little while for that impact to work, and you might be aware that they're kind of bragging about being blocked, but actually ultimately it is the right thing to do to actually get them out of your sphere and to really move them away. Copyright, if you think that something's been breaching copyright, so they might have taken an image that you think is copyrighted, for example, or some broadcast material that's copyrighted, report that, because actually social media companies do take copyright breach very, very seriously. and it comes down much faster, quite often, unfortunately, than reports of harassment or threats, etc. Screen grabs are really useful to actually, if you're making a documentation of harassment or a documentation of abuse that you've suffered, do take the screen grabs because they offer context. But always, always, always get the URL, because the URL is what the social companies will use to investigate. It's also what the police will use to investigate. And we know that we can doctor screen grabs. We know that screen grabs can be manipulated. We know that we can Photoshop to create something that looks very realistic. So the URL is always what they will want to see as part of the evidence trail. Do document online abuse and online harm, particularly if it's prolific, if it's pernicious, if it's coming from the same place again and again. Because again, if we are putting up barriers, blocking people, and they're coming back, then we can actually, again, like I say, we can make a report to police in the UK for harassment in that situation, and possibly malicious communications as well. If a crime has been committed, please do report it. It might be that you report it and you don't really get much of a response from the police, but actually, if we know that that is happening and that police are not responding, that is something that we need to be looking at as an industry. And it is important that we do make these reports so that police are aware of A, the crime, and B, the impact that crime can have. And obviously all crime that is reported should be documented. And so it does mean that then if we wanted to put an FOI in at some point to see how many times this kind of a crime was reported and then acted on or not acted on, we'd be able to actually get that information. So crime reporting is important for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, the most important is for your personal protection and to hold criminals to account. But there's all these other reasons as well that we do need to be considering when we make a criminal report. Debrief is really important. So if you're a journalist and you go out to a combat zone, you will come back and you will be debriefed so that you can actually share some of the trauma that you've experienced. Online harm is the same. So do debrief and do share that online trauma with somebody that you trust. So it might be a manager, it might be a colleague, it might be a friend or family member, it might be a trained professional, but do that so that you can actually start working through potential trauma that you might have experienced in those situations. Do make sure that you check your protections on a reasonably regular basis, because obviously those can change. And do take time out. So do give yourself a break away from the digital screen, give yourself a break away from the online working environment, and just make sure that you're giving yourself that chance to recover and recuperate. There's a few don'ts as well that I have. So it can be very tempting, particularly with personal comments, to bite back, to actually kind of challenge somebody. I'm not saying that you should never do that, that people should be allowed to be abusive without being challenged. But what I would say is always consider what benefit it will bring to you. Because if you get into an online spat with somebody and you challenge them and then they come back and they're even more vile or they bring more people with them, then obviously the benefit to you is probably less. If you think that that person will actually respond reasonably and you can have a conversation with them and they maybe will come to the point of apologizing or taking down what it is that they've said, then obviously that is a positive outcome. But it is always worth stopping and thinking, what is the benefit to me in this situation in terms of getting involved? Don't let the abuse continue. So block them, report them, starve their oxygen. Because while we don't necessarily want to see people biting back and being injured and harmed more in the process, what we don't want is for people to think that it's okay for them to behave that way. So by blocking them, you're putting up a barrier and saying, no, not in my space. And that's important, that we feel free to do that and that we can do that. Never think that this is part of the job. It shouldn't be acceptable to be abusive online. Make sure that you are talking to somebody about it, and make sure that you're never thinking, well, I should just go with this because this is part of the job, this is what it's like to be in journalism. If you're feeling upset about something that's happened to you in the line of work, talk to somebody about that, because that is important. And we want to retain good journalists in positions across the country. We don't want those people to be feeling squashed out because they're being harmed and they're not talking about it. Never feel ashamed, because it's never, online harm is quite often we are the victims and the abusers will try to make us feel like we are the instigators. So don't feel ashamed ashamed. Don't be frightened to ask for help. You will find when you put your hand up and ask for help that you are surrounded by people who might have had similar experiences. Don't lose faith in yourself. So if somebody's constantly telling you that you're rubbish at your job, that you're not qualified, etc., etc., it can really kind of put those worms of doubt into your mind. Instead, think, I'm not going to lose faith in myself, and actually remind yourself of what it is you've taken to get to this point, what your qualifications are, what your experience is, and why you are valid in this role. Don't let those voices bring doubt to your mind, and don't suffer alone. So I've said that multiple times. Do ask for that help. Do ask for support. Now, we are running low on time, but if anybody does have any top tips that you'd like to share, I really value you putting those into the Q&A, and I'll read through those at the end. And obviously, they will be documented for later as well. So again, do be aware that it's being recorded, and that anything that you do put in there will be shared and then recorded as well. And again, we can keep that anonymous. But anything that you've got that you feel I've not covered would be very useful. So this takes us on to the tools and resources section. These slides will be available on the Women in Journalism website, and all of the links are live links in these slides. So the top link is communicating with users in distress. That's very useful from the Samaritans, has some really practical guidance around what to say if somebody gets in touch and says that they're feeling suicidal or they're feeling like they might self-harm. All of these resources are available freely. So if you're working as a freelance or you're working for an organisation, these resources can be used by you. The Dart Centre has some really, really excellent resources around trauma. So if you're feeling like you've got, you need some support in that area, do go and look at the Dart Centre. I have just put the links for Meta and Twitter's Safety for Journalists and Help Centres on there, just because it's useful to have that if you need it. The Coalition Against Online Violence is part of is specifically for women, and it's worth going to have a look at. It's got some really fantastic resources around managing backlash. It's got help for really practical help and guidance around different types of online harm, and so definitely go and have a look at that. It's part of the International Federation of Women Journalists, Women in Media. Don't Take the Flak has got some nice videos and top tips around managing online harm as well, and if you put that hashtag into Twitter, it will bring those videos up for you. Headlines Network has got some excellent free at the point of use videos on its homepage around how to manage trauma and how to look at traumatic footage without being badly impacted by that. Headlines Network also does some excellent work in terms of mental health in journalism, and I really would recommend going to take a look at them. NCTJ Journalism Skills Academy, if you log in, you can use their resources around welfare, resilience and safety. Sorry, I don't know why that's popped up. And so that's something that's worth going to have a look at as well. The NUJ's got a really good safety toolkit, so I would definitely recommend going to take a look at that. It's also got information on there about slaps and how to manage litigation threats. And then finally, there's the link at the bottom there for the TikTok Safety Hub. And I just finally wanted to mention what we've got coming up as part of this safety series. So the rest of these workshops will be available only to Women in Journalism members. You can see the membership costs here. If you're not a member, it's worth going to have a look at those, seeing if you're eligible for any kind of discount as well. So we've got coming up over the course of the coming months, I'm doing a session specifically around high risk content. So if you've got something coming up that might be carrying risk of backlash or risk of online harm, it might be a controversial topic, it might be a high profile court case, it might be covering a match between two fractious teams. It might be anything. Obviously, we have physical safety risks in a lot of those situations, and there are also online safety risks. So that's coming up in June. We also have in September managing online backlash, and specifically top tips around that. We've got guest speakers from Headlines Network doing mental health and online harm protection and response. And then Dr. Sian Williams is going to be doing something specific around managing trauma from online harm. And then finally, in December, I'm going to be doing a session around physical safety. So please do think about joining Women in Journalism if you haven't already, so that you can come along to those events as well. And that takes us through to the end. I can see that there haven't been any questions that have come in, which is absolutely fine. Hopefully this has been useful for you. Please do follow me on Twitter if you would like to. I often share tips around online safety and news and events as well, which means that if anything it comes out, hopefully you'll spot that in my Twitter feed. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to share them. We have got a moment or two left, but otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today. Okay, so I can see, thank you very much for your thanks. And yeah, so I can see somebody's asked a question about trolling and locking accounts down. And so I will just quickly answer that. I would always come off Twitter. So if you're being trolled across any social platform, come off that space for a bit. Do talk to your manager about it if you need to, but just take yourself off, give yourself some protection. And a really good top tip is actually getting somebody who you trust to go into your accounts, to raise the level of your notification settings, to block and report people, gather evidence, and to take those actions on your behalf. And we will look at that in more specific detail with the backlash session in September. But yes, definitely take yourself out of that setting, but then do get somebody that you trust to help you with that. There's also some really good advice around those specific things on the Coalition Against Online Violence, which I've shared those links for as well. So thank you, everybody.